All right, so I'll leave a couple of minutes open at the end for questions if people would like to ask him. So the first one I wanted to put to Mr. Ziedler, which was just to see if we could understand better the climate.
Can you repeat the question?
I certainly can. The question I've just written for Mr. Ziedler is essentially this. We talked, both David did and Marco talked about the climate around 67, which allowed so many of these exciting projects to be built, and how this was explicitly a nationalist project, which combined with the prosperity and the economic growth of the time allowed for these really ambitious and in some cases really radical projects. So I guess I'd just like to hear from Mr. Ziedler what, in his experience, what that sounded like, how the government officials he dealt with, particularly around Ontario Place, how did they talk about the importance of architecture as a cultural pursuit or architecture as a nationalist pursuit. And I guess how could we try and create that link once more? How might we try and create some sort of political constituency for architecture, as sort of as an expression of our culture?
Why was it important for politicians to support architecture?
To support what?
To support architecture. Why was it good for politicians? Why did Diefenbaker support architecture?
Why shouldn't they?
There you go.
But Ontario Place was a response to Expo, yes?
Well, Ontario Place really was a strange thing because it was supposed to show Ontario Place as originally it was supposed to go on the exhibition place,
right.
But we felt that wasn't right because exhibition place was Ontario, was Toronto, not Ontario, and to make it Ontario, we felt that to go in the lake would be kind of a more neutral place to represent it, and that started it, and then from there on it developed.
David or Marco, do you want to take this and perhaps talk to the link between the nationalism of '67 and the ambition of the modernist project at that point in time? And I guess the broader question is how was it possible for a country as small as Canada was at that time to push so radically forward in design terms?
I have a problem understanding what it is.
How did you find the room to be so adventurous? How did you get the space, the political support, and the opportunity to be so ambitious?
I don't know really. We started to try to find an answer to the various questions that surrounded Ontario Place and to find out somehow what made Ontario Ontario, and that was the basic concept.
But there was one person in the government called Jim Ramsey,
right.
And he just rammed that thing through. No matter what, the Toronto was on their back all the time. And he just called in the provincial police and told them to go away, and it would
We don't need
never-
your building permit.
Never would have hadn't been for Jim Ramsey, I think, who overrode all government officials, which is amazing.
David, you want to speak to that? And please feel free to grab the mic.
I think the modernism of the 67 Centennial projects and of Expo itself is fairly self-evident in terms of, like, at least the architecture of these structures. What I find particularly, interesting, at least from my own sort of research and point of view, is how much of this exists seemingly at the twilight of a particular strain of modernism. That you see such a vast building wave throughout Canada and at Expo in particular of a specific style of modern architecture, and at the same point you're starting to see it sort of questioned in communities on the ground levels within cities, and that 10 years later this sort of architecture has in many cases fallen out of fashion. And coming back to Rayner Banham, Marco, you mentioned him a few times. And in 1976, when he does Urban Futures of the Recent Past, I think that phrase neatly encapsulates what happens with brutalist architecture by the mid-1970s, how the avant-garde transforms into something else, and Michael too, I think, riff off the message or thesis of your talk. At what point are we going to start seeing these? For what they are. Do we see brutalism as heritage in the same way that we might see Victorians or Edwardians now? Hopefully soon.
Yeah, well, just want to come back to the part of your question that had to do with how did this happen then and could it happen again? I think the short answer to the could it happen again is no. Yeah. We live in a very, very different environment, politically, culturally, et cetera, economically. But if you look back, if you actually parse out Diefenbaker's statement, it's very interesting because he talks about this as a project of national unity. And he talks about bringing together the two great peoples. This is 1960, he makes this. No one would talk about two great peoples in Canada anymore. Right. Two founding nations. We don't, politically it's a completely different perception. And we're also living in a time that has a very different idea about a national character or identity. Canada obviously identifies itself primarily as multicultural, not as a single identity that could be given a kind of easily legible expression through architecture or any other art form for that matter. Shortly after Justin Trudeau took office in 2015, he actually said Canada is the first post-national country. So I'm not sure what that means exactly. I have some idea. But it's very interesting that a prime minister would say that. So this is probably not a prime minister who would call for an architectural program of national unity, right? So I think we just live in a very, very different environment. And I think that the 1967 Centennial was really still, it was kind of a culmination to the stuff that was coming out of the Massey Report.
Well, is there a tension? And Michael, day to day, it's difficult perhaps. Part of the problem of trying to preserve modernist buildings in general, and particularly the brutalist ones, is that they are so, they're perceived to be, and in the case of brutalist buildings often are, so marked in their departure from history, right? They're so deliberately anti-historical, and that's certainly the case, not always, but certainly the case for a lot of the brutalist buildings we've been looking at today. And yet, if you look at I've joked about this before, but you go to any major Canadian city and you will find a brutalist cultural center. It's kind of, it is the Canadian national architectural language, right? As much as anything is, which is weird for a radical strain of modernism, which was all about being anti-authoritarian and deliberately breaking from tradition. So how do we get around that? Day to day, how do you make the case that these buildings are in fact historical, and then how might we think about that for contemporary practice, and try to resolve that tension between sort of building for the present while also attempting to speak to history.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think learning more about these buildings makes them more and more fantastic. I actually think of them as heroic buildings. They're stunningly challenging. They're really brave and adventurous. They do stuff that we don't even think of doing anymore. But that can give you some ambition to sort of say, why don't architects think big anymore? I think it's worth having that question asked. And then some of these buildings are kind of big bone buildings, and you can carve into them. You can do different things with them. So Robarts Library, they've changed around, and now you come in at the ground floor. You don't come in at the fourth floor. Like, it's just, you can make that kind of change happen. The National Arts Center is having a front put on. It's very, very interesting, very controversial in Ottawa because, as Marco said, that it turns its back to the city. Deliberately. And in this day and age, we're going, well, that was then and this is now. It should actually turn around and look at the city. So there's a glass face being put on one side. It was very controversial. I actually think it's going to be really successful. I think these big buildings can bear the brunt of change. I think some of the changes that have happened here haven't been as good with the Science Center, got to say. And some of the things at York University haven't been as good. I think this is where we need to have some respect for these buildings, because sometimes the change are done in the way of, that building was so stupid, I'm going to fix it. And it's actually, no, it's actually a very sensitive thing, and you need to understand the ethos of the building and the character of the building, so you can relate.
And at York, you have the Moriyama office, doing a building and a plan that really cuts against the grain of the
Yeah.
original campus plan.
Yeah, I would say not nice things about it.
Yeah.
But I think these buildings need to be thought of as carefully, and I think that we have so much to learn from these buildings. I was just, Bill Greer and I were just talking about this precast piece here, and the artistry that went into how you make that is astounding. Like,
Two
just
different textures of concrete, two different mixes of concrete.
and
too,
the
right?
form, and then how it's shot afterwards so that it gets the rough edge. All these things were really careful. It's like Japanese pottery. It's like a just amazingly carefully crafted piece of work. And so you can learn so much from these buildings that is something I think we need to bring back into current architectural vocabularies.
Any questions from her? All right, shoot. Don't worry about the mic. We can go here.
Michael, I think it's a question for everyone, but your morning talk was about everyday buildings or everyday architecture. But what about the homes we live in, the schools we're building for our children? They seem to be, with a few exceptions, very resistant to innovation. You think of the ethnic diversity of this country, and you go to purely not Canadian-born neighborhoods, and the houses look just the same as they do everywhere else. There might be religious buildings which are distinctively of the culture which created them, but the domestic architecture, and of course it's architecture which is produced by people who call themselves design builders. Is there how can we generate excitement and adventure and risk-taking?
I'm not sure I understand exactly, but I guess this is the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, and so I'd say that Architectural Conservancy has grown over time. It started out, you were just looking at ruins, literally. It had to be a ruined fort, whatever. Then you could start to rebuild that ruin and make it you could actually demolish bits and add bits, and you could restore the ruin. And then it became kind of villages, and so an interest in the character of neighborhoods. Now it's almost, there's a kind of understanding about conservation being almost ecological or environmental, that you're actually talking about the environment of a place and the nature of a city. And so you're not actually talking about landmarks anymore, you're actually talking about the context of those landmarks. And so you are interested in everything that makes those up. And in doing that, there needs to be ways to think about conservation in different ways, because it can't all be like you're conserving Osgoode Hall. It has to be, there has to be variations on how you treat and relate buildings. And I think people have an innate sense of that. They're saying, I live on a street and I really hate what the guy did next door because it's wrecking the neighborhood. Well, there can be all kinds of NIMBY aspects to that, but there can be a legitimate concern about the quality of neighborhoods. And I don't think our municipal system has a way to handle that kind of concern, and I don't think people have a way to really vocalize how to address those concerns. So there's a bit of a conflict that we're trying to deal with now, I think. It relates to, if you're thinking about conservation, it's just actually thinking of the whole wide range of things, because now people are interested in conserving modern buildings, they're interested in conserving commercial retail signs, they're interested in archaeological things, they're interested in landscape. So the passion for conserving and understanding our environment has just got much broader than it's ever used to be.
I'm gonna forget the mic. Sorry, Kathy, I should have learned from your example. One last question, and I'll put this one to David at least first. You are talking, you really focusing your talk on this moment that was when all of this, what could loosely be called urban renewal and modern reconstruction of the city was happening just at the end of the window for that kind of work, just before the Jane Jacobs critique.
Yeah.
And in Toronto, the reform era began and really began to roll that back, just as happened in cities across North America. I guess, Jacobs is very much on people's minds again these days. But the question is how to bring that critique, or how to resolve that critique, and that the emphasis that is placed on traditional urban form and on the walkable city and on historic preservation. How do we, I guess what I want to ask is what is productive from the heroic work that was built in Montreal, in and around Expo? What of that period should we attempt to learn from? And how could we, or is there anything of that era that would be useful in terms of governance or in terms of specific ideas about the city, that you see as being valuable to addressing today's different set of challenges?
That's a big question.
It is a good question.
Can I get back to you with like a 5-page essay on it? No.
Well, I guess if we're going to be recuperating, the slab towers of the 60s and 70s,
Right.
What in the urbanism of that period, actually works? I guess would be a more concise way to put it. Which should we value?
Well, much of the infrastructure that's developed in Montreal in this period is actually still well used, and in contrast to many American cities, when you get this narrative of sort of hollowing out cores and suburbanization, downtown Montreal certainly doesn't experience this. Speaking to the Expo Site itself, the Expo Site remains very well used by members of the public, receiving as a park now. It was rehabilitated. The city made the mistake of trying to continue the site in its original vocation in the 1970s and 1980s. That didn't work. There's no sense in trying to run a World Expo in perpetuity. These are, by their very definition, ephemeral events. But upon reconsideration, the site is still sort of well loved and well used as a public park now. In terms of sort of lessons from this era, I think, speaking to Montreal in particular, that this area has taken on the status of a sort of foundational myth. In particular, speaking to the province's French-Canadian majority, who prior to the 1960s felt cut off from social and economic advancement, and who composed the majority of the city's working class. The mass development and urban change experienced in the city of Montreal in the 1960s actually has a quite positive legacy. Because it's seen as that moment when the French-Canadian majority of the province took control and really got their confidence. If you were to sort of go around and ask a survey post Expo, why does it matter? What is the long-term legacy significance of hosting this event? You have a lot of people, particularly Francophones, who describe it and the 1960s in Montreal in just those terms, because that city's sort of modern coming of age is intimately tied in with French Canadian nationalism. So there's nothing to rehabilitate in a lot of ways. Certainly the built forms of that period are struggling. But I'll contend that's just because they were cheaply built to meet the deadlines. In contrast to brutalist and modern architecture in other cities, which sometimes is described as dystopian, in Montreal it's often considered a national point of pride. It fits in within the nationalist narrative that took hold in the aftermath of the Quiet Revolution. in working to sort of make assessments on other Centennial structures, we ought to sort of historicize them in our own sort of local ways, and that might sort of bring back popular attention or enjoyment to the original structures, in the same way that Quebec has been able to do.
Thanks, Michael. Do you have anything to say to a group of preservationists about what it is that we should actually look back fondly upon on that era of the evil urban renewal blockbusting urbanism?
Oh, it's funny. I think it's interesting. When I was younger, we thought Metro was horrible. The City of Toronto was wonderful. But Metropolitan Toronto actually went into huge amounts of debt to build infrastructure. So they borrowed money to build the subway. They borrowed money to build our sewer systems and all these immense things. And that's the last time we've had investment in those major systems. And I think understanding the role of government to create and invest, the need to actually go into debt periodically to build things, the sheer ambition and that sense of growth that can actually happen. And I think it's very interesting, because we were earlier talking about neighborhoods and people be concerned about neighborhoods. The other aspect of that is we need architects to have guts to try things that are new and interesting. So we can learn that also from this period. We can learn that we have to try different new things. It may run up against other people. People may have different ambitions, but I think as a city, we need to have both those things. We need to have concern about communities and neighborhoods, but we also have to have the ability to challenge what the city's about.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap up. So, one more question before we go? Jocelyn?
I'm curious about that comment in terms of thinking about the architecture of the Pan Am Games, because that was a very big infrastructural investment and architectural investment by the province and the GTA. My understanding is that it didn't go into debt during the construction of these buildings, but I personally don't see a lot of them as being particularly architecturally daring. So, and I mean, even in the context of thinking about very large events in which lots of architecture is built, in the or in the buildings that are built for the Centennial, this seems like a very, very different approach to architecture. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I barely noticed the Pan Am Games.
Yeah.
I can address that, I think, as well. In contrast to the mid-century state, the Canadian state in the 50s and 60s, I mean, which is able to sponsor through infrastructure dollars the mass development of mega projects throughout the country. I mean, given neoliberal conditions, I mean, since the 1980s in particular, I mean, there's no longer either sort of popular faith or sort of social or political capital to do the same sorts of things. Instead, I mean, one of the things that you note about the Pan Am Games is that you get these, and you see this in other mega events too, and mega events like World Exhibitions or Olympics or Pan Am Games are increasingly wrapped up in this role of build these because we have to build infrastructure, and if you build this, then it will give us a deadline to build things, because otherwise it seems like the state, which is really the only sort of construct that's capable of undertaking projects of this size, won't do anything. It seems as though
they're creating political capital.
Yeah, it seems like mega events like the Pan Am Games are increasingly being harnessed as tools to create political capital for the purposes of infrastructure spending, because in normal conditions, spending large dollars on infrastructure would be politically unpalatable.
Yeah, very true. I agree with this translate
With
Expo and then the Olympics.
and then the Olympics, yeah. Well, with
That's
that,
a depressing place to stop.
it is a depressing place to start. We heard some inspiring words earlier about figuring out how to think big and to entertain some bold ideas for the future. So we've got to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Anybody would like to stay for the AGM? We're going to start that in 5 minutes. I can find my papers.